July 7, 1968. At 3:47 a.m., Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, the man Harlem knew simply as Bumpy, collapsed on the floor of Wells Restaurant on the corner of 145th Street and 7th Avenue. A sudden heart attack. At 62, the king of Harlem fell without warning, without a declared successor, without a criminal will. And when the sun rose that summer Monday, the streets of New York's most famous black neighborhood woke up orphaned. The body was still warm when the first moves began. At the funeral, held 4 days later at Abyssinian Baptist Church, more than 1,000 people attended. They wept for a legend. But amid the tears were calculating glances, restless hands in the pockets of expensive suits, discreet whispers in the church pews. Bumpy's death was not merely the end of an era, it was the opening of hunting season, and the trophy was all of Harlem. For nearly 4 decades, Bumpy Johnson had ruled the neighborhood's underworld with an iron fist wrapped in velvet. He was not just a criminal, he was a street statesman. He protected local businesses, funded schools, paid widows' rent, and broke the legs of anyone who dared sell drugs near playgrounds. Under his command, there was order, there were rules. The Italian mafia respected boundaries, corrupt cops knew exactly how much they were to receive, and small-time operators knew their place in the hierarchy. Harlem was a kingdom, and Bumpy was its philosopher king. But now the throne was empty. In the first weeks after the funeral, the structure began to crack. Nicky Barnes, an ambitious 35-year-old drug dealer operating on 116th Street, made the first move. He expanded his operations into territories that had previously been neutral, areas where Bumpy had maintained gentlemen's agreements. Barnes had no patience for chivalry. He wanted an empire. In the second week of August, 3 of his men were found dead in an alley on 132nd Street. Message sent. But by whom? Guy Fisher, another rising operator, also saw opportunity in the chaos. He controlled several nightclubs and had connections to heroin suppliers out of Philadelphia. With Bumpy dead, Fisher began negotiating directly with the Genovese mafia, something unthinkable just months earlier. The Italian families, who for years had respected Bumpy's agreements, now saw Harlem as no man's land, territory free for conquest. Street corners became battlefields. What had once been handshakes and verbal agreements turned into nighttime gunfire and abandoned bodies. The 32nd Precinct recorded 47 drug-related homicides between July and December 1968. The year before, there had been 19. Harlem was bleeding. Residents felt the difference. Mrs. Ruth, who had sold flowers on 125th Street for 23 years, closed her stand in September. There was no one left to protect her, she told a reporter from Amsterdam News. Before, I could work until 9 at night. Now, by 5, I already hear gunshots. Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., speaking from the pulpit of the same church where Bumpy had lain in state, called for peace. But his words echoed hollow. In the streets, only violence had a voice. And it was in this climate of anarchy that Frank Lucas watched. He did not take part in the disputes. He made no public threats. He did not expand territory through violence. Frank simply observed. He was 38 in 1968 and had spent the previous 15 years as Bumpy Johnson's driver, bodyguard, and protege. He had learned at the most refined school of crime, at the master's feet. While Nicky Barnes and Guy Fisher fought over street corners and retail spots, Frank was thinking bigger. While other dealers negotiated with the Italians, paying inflated prices for third-rate heroin, Frank planned to cut out the middleman, all middlemen. He had an idea born from the stories Bumpy had told him, an audacious idea, almost impossible, but possible. During the last months of Bumpy's life, Frank had listened as the old man talked about the Vietnam War, about how American soldiers were coming back addicted, about how heroin from Southeast Asia was purer, more potent, about military supply routes. Bumpy would philosophize about these things during long nights at Small's Paradise, the jazz club where they conducted business. Frank stored every word away in his mind. Now, in the vacuum left by his mentor's death, while Harlem burned with petty disputes over scraps, Frank Lucas was laying out a plan to control the entire banquet, not with violence, not with territory, but with product. The best product, the purest, the cheapest. Heroin that would come straight from Thailand, transported inside the coffins of dead soldiers returning from the war. October 1968. While newspapers reported yet another shooting on 147th Street, another body pulled from the Harlem River, Frank Lucas bought a one-way ticket to Bangkok. He carried $60,000 in cash, saved over years of loyal service to Bumpy, and a plan that would change the drug game in New York forever. Harlem was sinking into chaos, but in the middle of the storm, Frank Lucas was preparing to become not just another dealer fighting over corners. He would be the hurricane that redefined the entire business. Bumpy's death had opened a power vacuum, and nature, as Frank well knew, abhors a vacuum. The question was not whether someone would fill the space left by the king. The question was, who would be smart enough to build not a kingdom, but an empire? Bangkok, November 1968. The humid heat clung to the skin like a second layer. Frank Lucas stepped out of a taxi on Sukhumvit Road at 11:23 a.m., wearing a gray suit already showing sweat stains. He carried a brown leather suitcase containing $60,000 in $100 bills. His destination was a small bar called the Lucky Star, 3 blocks south of the Chatterchak Market. There, seated at a table in the back, waited the cousin he had not seen in 4 years. Leslie Atkinson, known on the streets of Harlem as Ike, was 41 years old and had a resume that blended heroism and pragmatism. A master sergeant in the United States Army, 2 medals for valor, 17 months of combat in Vietnam. But Ike had discovered something more valuable than medals in the Asian jungle. He had discovered the Golden Triangle. When Frank entered the bar, Ike lifted only his chin in greeting. No hugs, no smiles. This was not a family reunion. It was business. Frank sat down, ordered a whiskey he would not drink, and got straight to the point. I need a supplier, someone who grows his own poppies. No Italian middlemen, no Corsican mafia. No one touching the product before it reaches my hands. Ike lit a Marlboro cigarette, exhaled the smoke slowly, studying his cousin. You know the risk you're asking for. This isn't just bringing a kilo in a suitcase. You're talking about tons. Military aircraft, supply routes. If anyone finds out, they won't arrest you, Frank. They'll bury you. Frank didn't blink. Bumpy taught me one thing. The greatest risk isn't being bold. It's being mediocre. I'm willing to pay for audacity. Ike took one last drag and stubbed out the cigarette. I know a man, Mong, lives in the mountains of Laos near the Thai border. He's not an ordinary criminal. He's a general. Commands a private army of 3,000 men. He grows heroin the way Americans grow corn, and his product, cousin, is 99% pure. Frank felt his heart race, but kept his expression neutral. How do we get it to New York? Ike leaned over the table. C-130 Air Force planes bring the coffins of fallen soldiers back home. Dover Air Force Base, Delaware. From there, the bodies are distributed for funerals across the country. No one searches a coffin with the American flag draped over it. No one dares. The audacity of the plan was obscene, sacrilegious, brilliant. 3 days later, Frank and Ike were in a military jeep driving along dirt roads in northern Thailand. The driver, an American soldier being paid $500 a week to look the other way, drove in silence. At 4:40 p.m., they arrived at a mountain village. Wooden houses, barefoot children, chickens scratching at the red earth, and armed men. Many armed men. The general was waiting for them in a house larger than the others, seated in a wicker chair surrounded by 4 bodyguards carrying AK-47 rifles. He was perhaps 55 years old, his face marked by sun and war, eyes that had seen a great deal of death. He spoke broken English, learned from CIA agents who financed his anti-communist militia. Ike made the introductions. Frank, this is General Vang Pao. General, this is my cousin from New York. The general did not offer his hand. He simply studied Frank as if appraising livestock. How much do you want to buy? 100 kilos to start. If the quality is what you promise, 500 kilos a month within 6 months. The general smiled for the first time, revealing teeth stained with betel nut.
My product is better than a promise. It's a guarantee. You want to see? He led them to a shed behind the house. Inside, burlap sacks were stacked to the ceiling. The general opened one, plunged his hand inside, and brought out a handful of fine white powder, as soft as talc. He tasted it with the tip of his tongue, then offered it to Frank. Taste it, but only 1 grain. More than that, you'll pass out. Frank touched his tongue to the powder. He felt the instant numbness, the terrifying purity. This was not the cut heroin circulating in New York, mixed with quinine and lactose. This was pure poison, pure power. How much? Frank asked. $4,000 per kilo. Here, in your hand. Transport is your problem. Frank did the math in his head.
In New York, that kilo would be worth $300,000 after being cut and distributed. The profit margin was obscene. He accepted with a handshake, but the return journey would be the real test. Ike explained the scheme during the flight back to Bangkok. We've got 3 sergeants at Udorn Air Base in Thailand. They oversee the loading of the coffins. For $1,000 per coffin, they make sure your merchandise travels safely. The bodies are real, the coffins are real, but inside the lining, between the metal and the flag, there's room for 5 kilos of heroin per coffin. And in Dover? Frank asked. I've got 2 guys there, ex-military. They work in the base mortuary. They remove the merchandise before the coffins are released to civilian funeral homes. $500 per coffin for them. Frank weighed the risks. Military police, federal investigators, DEA agents. One slip, one random inspection, and the entire operation would collapse. No, worse than that, he would be arrested for desecrating the dead, for using American heroes as mules. The sentence would be life, maybe death row. But the reward? Ah, the reward. Back in Harlem in December, Frank began building the infrastructure. He rented an improvised lab in a basement on 145th Street. He hired Puerto Rican chemists who knew how to cut heroin while maintaining quality. He recruited street dealers who had never worked for Nicky Barnes or Guy Fisher. New people, people who owed loyalty only to him. He named his product Blue Magic. Heroin at 10% purity, still twice as potent as anything else on the streets. Dark blue packaging, a trademark, like a legitimate company. In January 1969, the first shipment arrived. 20 kilos hidden in 4 coffins of soldiers killed in the Tet Offensive. Frank waited in a van parked 2 blocks from a funeral home in Newark. When Ike showed up with the bags, Frank felt his hands tremble for the first time. Ike noticed. Nervous, cousin? Frank stowed the bags in the trunk. Just aware that we've just crossed a line there's no coming back from. Ike shrugged. Bumpy always said hell is full of men who played it safe. We're playing to win. And with those 20 kilos of white powder, Frank Lucas began building an empire that within 3 years would move $250 million. An empire built on courage, betrayal, and the bodies of American soldiers who would never return home. The plan was audacious, it was obscene, it was perfect. February 1970. Dirty snow piled up along the gutters of 116th Street as Jazzy Mike, a 34-year-old addict who had been snorting heroin since 1963, walked into the ground floor apartment where Red Top, his usual supplier, sold $5 bags. But Red Top wasn't there. In his place, a skinny kid, maybe 19 years old, wearing a brand new leather jacket, slid a dark blue packet through the gap in the change door. "This is Blue Magic," the kid said. $10, twice as strong as anything you've ever used. Use half your normal amount or you'll pass out. Jazzy Mike laughed dismissively. I've heard that story 1,000 times. Every dealer says he's got the best product. The kid didn't argue. He just shrugged. Your choice, old man, but don't say I didn't warn you. 45 minutes later, Jazzy Mike woke up on the floor of his bedroom, pants soaked with urine, dried foam at the corner of his mouth, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. He had used only 1/3 of his usual dose and had almost died. When he managed to stand up at 4:30 p.m., he had only one thought. He needed more of that stuff. That was how the revolution began. Within 3 weeks, Blue Magic was the only drug that mattered in Harlem.
The blue packets appeared on corners Frank Lucas controlled with military precision. 112th Street, 125th, 135th, 147th. Always the same spots, always the same quality, always new, young, loyal sellers. Kids Frank personally recruited, paying them $100 a day, 3 times more than any other dealer. The competitor's reaction was panic. Nicky Barnes, who dominated 116th Street with heroin cut to 4% purity, saw his sales drop by 60% in 2 weeks. In March, he called an emergency meeting in the basement of the Turntable, a jazz club on Lenox Avenue. 8 of Harlem's biggest dealers showed up: Guy Fisher, Leroy, Nicky Barnes, Frank James, Ishmael Muhammad, men who together moved $2 million a month. "Who is this son of a bitch?" Barnes slammed his fist on the table. "Where is he getting this product? The Italians say they're not supplying him. The French connection isn't either. So who is it?" No one had an answer. Frank Lucas was a ghost. He didn't frequent the nightclubs where dealers flaunted their wealth. He wore no flashy jewelry. He didn't drive gold-plated Cadillacs. He lived in a modest apartment on Convent Avenue with his Puerto Rican wife and their 3 children. He attended Knicks games at Madison Square Garden, but always in mid-range seats, never in luxury boxes. He walked the streets of Harlem at 7 a.m., buying a newspaper and coffee, like any ordinary working man. "Bumpy taught me," Frank would say to his closest lieutenants, "the hardest target to hit is the one nobody sees." But money was impossible to hide completely. By April 1970, Frank Lucas was moving $375,000 a week. By July, $500,000. He bought a mansion in Teaneck, New Jersey for $140,000 in cash, $100 bills stacked on the table of a visibly shaken real estate broker. He bought a fleet of cars for his extended family: a Dodge Charger for his brother, a Buick Riviera for his mother, a Mercedes-Benz 280 SE for himself, painted a discreet brown, no gold, no chrome. Yet Frank's restrained display of wealth stood in stark contrast to the damage blue magic was inflicting on the streets. Harlem Hospital recorded 127 overdose cases between February and June of 1970. During the same period the previous year, there had been 43. Dr. Benjamin Ward, chief of emergency medicine, gave an interview to the New York Times on July 28 describing the crisis. "We're seeing heroin 3-4 times purer than normal. Users aren't prepared for it. Their bodies can't handle it. We're losing 2-3 patients a week." Frank read those reports in the New York Times every morning, drinking black coffee in the kitchen of the Teaneck mansion. Did he feel anything? Remorse? Guilt? If he did, he didn't show it. Bumpy had taught him, business is business. No one forces anyone to use heroin. The demand exists. Someone will supply it. Better that it be you. But it wasn't just the product that gave Frank power. It was the system. He structured the operation like a corporation. Brothers and cousins filled key positions. His younger brother, Huey, oversaw cutting and packaging at the 145th Street lab. Another brother, Turner, managed distribution. Cousins controlled specific territories: blood loyalty, family trust. Unlike Barnes and the others, who relied on partners who could turn informant at any moment. Frank also maintained strategic relationships with the police. Not all officers, only the right ones. Sergeant Lou Toback of the 32nd Precinct received $3,000 a month to ensure that patrols did not bother certain sales points. Detective Eddie Jones of the Narcotics Division tipped him off when federal operations were being planned. It cost Frank $8,000 a month, cheap considering what was at stake. At the Lenox Lounge, where Bumpy used to conduct his business, Frank would occasionally appear on Thursday nights. He always sat in the same corner, drinking Chivas Regal with water, listening to John Coltrane on the turntable. Local businessmen would come over to greet him. Church pastors came to thank him for anonymous donations. Frank financed renovations, paid electricity bills for desperate families, handed out turkeys on Thanksgiving. "Just like Bumpy did," commented Mrs. Sarah, who had been selling flowers on 125th Street for 31 years. "Frank takes care of the community. He's not like those others who only take and never give back." But Frank knew that peace was a temporary illusion. In August 1970, Nicky Barnes made the first move. He hired 2 men from Philadelphia to ambush one of Frank's sales points on 147th Street.
The operation was disastrous. Both were shot dead before they could even draw their weapons. Frank had lookouts on every rooftop, 15 and 16-year-old kids with walkie-talkies and rifles, a security system better than any bank's. 3 days later, Frank sent a message. No threat, no violence, just a wooden box delivered to Barnes' apartment door. Inside, $50,000 in cash and a typewritten note. Respect is a two-way street. You can work with me or against me. Choose wisely. Barnes chose to work. He became a distributor of blue magic in the area he still controlled. Frank allowed him to keep 30% of the profits. Strategic generosity. Bumpy would have approved. By the end of 1970, Frank Lucas controlled 80% of the heroin market in Harlem. He directly employed 42 people, all family members or relatives' referrals. He moved $50 million a year, and no one, not the New York City Police, not the FBI, not rival traffickers, could understand how a man who had come out of nowhere had built an empire so quickly. The secret lay in what Bumpy had always preached: invisibility, strategy, superior product, absolute loyalty. Frank Lucas was not just another drug dealer. He was the legitimate successor to the throne Bumpy had left vacant, and Harlem, bleeding and addicted, bowed before the new king. March 1971. At 2:15 a.m., the phone rang at the Teaneck mansion. Frank Lucas answered on the third ring, already fully awake. He never slept deeply. Bumpy had taught him, powerful men who sleep heavily wake up dead.
The voice on the other end was Doc, one of his oldest lieutenants. "Frank, we've got a problem. Someone stole 3 kilos from the lab on 145th. It happened between midnight and 1 a.m. Door forced open, safe cracked. An inside job." Frank silently put on his pants and shirt. He told his wife he'd be back before breakfast. A lie. That kind of problem required time and method. He arrived at the lab at 3:40. 6 men were waiting for him, all family. Huey, his younger brother, had bruises on his face. "They caught me by surprise when I was coming in. 2 masked guys. They beat me, tied me up. They knew the safe code, Frank. Someone on the inside passed the information." Frank walked slowly through the lab. He examined the open safe. The door pried open with a crowbar. Chairs overturned. Everything looked staged, too theatrical. He turned to Huey. "You're lying." The silence in the room grew thick. Huey took a step back. "Frank, I swear it was 2 guys. I didn't see their faces. Frank raised his hand. "Silence. I won't repeat myself. You stole from me. You probably sold it to Barnes or some other competitor. 3 kilos are worth $90,000 on the street. You thought I wouldn't find out." Huey began to sweat. "Brother, you're my blood. I would never—" Frank took 3 steps and stopped inches from Huey's face. "I have 3 options. First, I kill you right now. Second, I hand you over to the police. Third, you pay me back every cent within the next 90 days, working for free, and you never again look at what's mine." Huey dropped to his knees. "I choose the third, brother. I swear I'll pay everything back." Frank looked at the other men in the room. "Does anyone else have something to hide from me? Anyone else think I'm an idiot?" Absolute silence. Then it's settled. "Huey, you'll be cleaning bathrooms at my sales points for 3 months. You'll see up close what your stupid decisions cost, and if a single gram of product goes missing under your supervision, I'll assume it was you, and the third option will no longer exist." Frank didn't kill Huey. He didn't need to. The humiliation did the job. In 90 days, Huey paid back every cent, working 16 hours a day, and no one ever tried to steal from Frank Lucas again. But internal threats were only half the problem. In June 1971, Detective Richie Roberts from the Essex County Prosecutor's Office in New Jersey began asking uncomfortable questions. Roberts was 32, divorced, lived in a messy apartment in Newark, and had a reputation as the only honest cop in the narcotics division, something as rare as a unicorn. Roberts had found nearly $1 million in marked cash during a seizure in January. He returned every cent. His colleagues called him an idiot. His superiors grew suspicious. Honest men are dangerous in corrupt systems. Now, Roberts was investigating a heroin distribution network that seemed to operate without any connection to the Italian mafia families. "That doesn't make sense," he told his partner, Toback, during a stakeout on 125th Street. "All heroin in New York goes through the 5 families. It's always been that way. But this blue magic shows up out of nowhere, takes over the market, and no Italians are involved." Toback, the same sergeant who was receiving $3,000 a month from Frank, shrugged. "Maybe it's a small operation, not worth investigating." Roberts disagreed. He began to follow leads. He talked to addicts, mapped out selling points, photographed distributors. By August, he had 47 photos of different operators selling little blue packets, but not a single photo of the top of the chain. Frank knew he was being investigated. Toback informed him weekly, but Roberts was a different kind of problem. He didn't take bribes. He had no vices, no lovers who could be used as leverage. He was incorruptible, the worst kind of enemy. In September, Frank called a meeting in the basement of a barber shop on 145th Street. His 10 main operators attended, including 2 former cops who now worked as security. Frank tossed the photos Toback had stolen from Roberts' file onto the table. "This man is a problem. He doesn't stop, he doesn't sleep, he doesn't take money, and he's getting close. We need a plan that doesn't involve killing him. Killing an honest cop brings federal attention, FBI, DEA, the whole structure collapses." One of the former cops, a man named Mac, leaned forward. "So we discredit him. We plant false evidence, make it look like he's obsessed with the wrong case, wasting public resources." Frank shook his head. "Roberts was too smart. He would verify everything. We need something better. We need to make him look somewhere else." At that moment, Frank Lucas made the riskiest decision of his career. He would feed Roberts real information about a rival drug dealer. He would sacrifice Tango, a Dominican operator who controlled heroin in the Bronx.
Tango was neither ally nor enemy, just a disposable piece on the board. For 3 months, through an anonymous informant, Roberts received details about Tango's operation, stash locations, delivery schedules, bank accounts, all real, all verifiable. In December 1971, Roberts led a raid that resulted in the largest heroin seizure in New Jersey history up to that point: 45 kilos, $8 million in cash, 23 arrests. Roberts was celebrated, promoted, and temporarily distracted from blue magic. But while Frank was dealing with Roberts, another threat was emerging. Leroy Barnes, who had agreed to work as one of Frank's distributors, was building a parallel empire. By January 1972, Barnes had his own supply line, an inferior product, but cheaper. He was stealing customers along the edges of Frank's territory, small bites, testing limits. Frank found out through Jimmy, an addict who worked as an informant in exchange for a daily packet of blue magic. "Barnes is telling people on the street that you're old, that Bumpy is dead and his era is over, that it's time for new blood." Frank did not react with anger. He reacted with strategy. He set up a meeting with Barnes at the Lenox Lounge, Thursday, 8:30 p.m. Both arrived with security. They sat at a table in the back while Miles Davis played over the speakers. Frank ordered Chivas Regal. Barnes ordered brandy. "I hear you think I'm old," Frank began. Barnes smiled. "Not old, just comfortable. You built an empire, Frank, but empires get lazy." Frank sipped his whiskey slowly. "Let me tell you a story. Bumpy once told me there are 2 kinds of power: the power everyone sees and the power no one sees. You like the first kind: jewelry, cars, clubs. You want everyone to know who Nicky Barnes is. I prefer the second kind." "And what's the difference?" Barnes asked. Frank leaned in. "The first kind goes to prison. The second kind dies old and rich." Barnes laughed, but the laughter never reached his eyes. "Are you threatening me? I'm educating you. You can keep your parallel operation. You can pretend you're growing. But the day you actually threaten my territory, you'll find out that I know exactly how many men you have, where they sleep, how much you owe, and who in your organization is already on my payroll." Barnes went pale. "You're bluffing." Frank placed an envelope on the table.
Inside were photos of 3 of Barnes's top lieutenants going in and out of locations controlled by Frank. Dates, times, details of meetings. "I'm not at war with you, Leroy, but if I were, you'd already have lost." Barnes never again tried to expand against Frank Lucas. April 1972. Frank controlled more territory than ever before. But he slept 3 hours a night, trusted 5 people in the entire world, carried a gun to buy a newspaper, had 3 different cars, changed routes daily, never slept 2 nights in a row in the same place. Absolute power had arrived, but it brought with it absolute paranoia. And deep down, Frank knew. It wasn't a question of if he would fall. It was a question of when. January 1975. Frank Lucas was 45 years old and controlled the largest heroin trafficking operation New York had ever seen. 7 years since Bumpy's death, 7 years building, brick by brick, what was now an empire valued at $300 million. But on that cold winter morning, sitting in the office of his mansion in Teaneck, Frank did not feel like a king. He felt like a general in a permanent war. On the mahogany table lay stacks of coded ledgers. Each page represented a week of operations, revenues, expenses, payments, investments. Frank Lucas ran crime the way General Motors ran automobiles. There were departments, hierarchies, performance metrics, year-end bonuses. Huey, now fully rehabilitated after the betrayal of 1971, came in with coffee and the New York Times. He also brought a brown envelope. Inside were surveillance photos taken by former CIA agents Frank had hired for $5,000 a week. The photos showed Detective Richie Roberts meeting with a federal prosecutor. "He's building a case," Huey said. 3 years investigating. He knows you exist. He just doesn't know how to prove it. Frank studied the photos in silence. Roberts was persistent, dangerous, but predictable. Honest men always are. They follow rules, and rules can be manipulated. "Keep monitoring him. I want to know every meeting, every witness he interviews, every document he files. Knowledge is power, Huey. Bumpy taught me that." Frank's empire in 1975 was a perfectly lubricated machine. 15 cutting labs spread across New York and New Jersey, 242 active points of sale, 417 employees on the payroll, including 52 corrupt police officers in 5 precincts. Blue Magic controlled 87% of the heroin market in Harlem, 61% in the Bronx, 43% in Brooklyn. But numbers didn't tell the whole story.
The real genius lay in the laundering. Frank had purchased 27 legitimate commercial properties, laundromats, beauty salons, restaurants, gas stations. Each processed $50,000 to $100,000 a month in dirty cash, turning it into reportable revenue. He had accountants in Manhattan who never asked questions, lawyers who specialized in finding tax loopholes, bankers in the Bahamas who moved money through tax havens. In March 1973, Frank deposited $8 million into a numbered account in the Cayman Islands. In August of the same year, another $6 million. He did not spend ostentatiously. He didn't buy yachts. He didn't wear gold chains. He drove a brown Mercedes. He wore high-quality but discreet gray suits. When he went to Madison Square Garden to watch the Knicks, he sat in the stands, not in the luxury boxes. Invisibility, he repeated constantly to his brothers. Money no one sees can't be stolen. But maintaining an empire required more than discretion. It required calculated violence. In June 1974, a distributor named Stevie Blue tried to create his own brand, competing directly with Blue Magic on 147th Street. Frank sent word. Stevie ignored it. 3 days later, Stevie woke up tied to a chair in an abandoned warehouse in the South Bronx. Frank was sitting across from him, drinking coffee from a disposable cup. "You were warned, Stevie. You chose to ignore it. Now I need to send a message to the others." Frank didn't torture Stevie. He didn't break bones. He simply showed photos of Stevie's mother, his sister, his 8-year-old niece, addresses, work schedules, the routes they took every day. "I'm not threatening your family," Frank said calmly. "I'm showing you that I could, but I choose not to.
You have 48 hours to shut down your operation and leave New York. If you stay, I'll assume you've chosen war, and in war, there are no rules. Stevie Blue was in Atlanta 36 hours later. Frank Lucas understood what Bumpy had always preached. Unnecessary violence is weakness. Strategic violence is power. In 7 years, Frank had ordered only 4 deaths, each necessary, each justified by existential threats. Compared to Nicky Barnes, who killed for respect, or the Italians who killed out of tradition, Frank was almost a pacifist. But Bumpy's true lesson lay in another dimension of power. In October 1974, Frank donated $200,000 to renovate 3 public schools in Harlem, anonymously, of course. He paid for scholarships for 47 neighborhood children. He financed a health clinic on 125th Street that treated addicts free of charge. The irony was not lost on him. He grew rich selling drugs and spent part of the profits saving addicts. But hypocrisy was a luxury for those with a clean conscience. Frank had no illusions about himself. "I'm a criminal," he once said to his wife, Eva, during dinner at the mansion, "but I can be a criminal who makes a difference." Bumpy protected Harlem. I do the same. Eva, who had grown up in Puerto Rico and knew real poverty, did not judge. "You feed 200 families every month, Frank. You pay bills. You prevent evictions. The government doesn't do that. The church doesn't do that. You do." But even his wife did not know the full extent of the empire. In December 1974, an internal audit commissioned by Frank showed a net worth of $283 million. In January 1975, it surpassed $300 million. Frank Lucas was one of the wealthiest black men in America, and no one knew his name. February 1975. Frank climbed to the terrace of his mansion in Teaneck at 6:30 a.m. The sun was rising over New York, the skyline etched against a peach-colored sky. From where he stood, he could see the tops of the buildings in Harlem, 15 kilometers away. His territory, his kingdom. But in the silence of that morning, Frank thought about the price. He slept 3 hours a night. He trusted no one completely, not even his brothers. He had enemies on every corner, honest cops, envious drug dealers, desperate addicts, mafia families waiting for an opportunity. Every conversation was potentially recorded. Every friend was a potential informant. Every day could be the last. Bumpy had once told him, 3 months before he died, as they drank whiskey at Small's Paradise, "Power isn't having everything, Frank. It's knowing you can lose everything at any moment and still playing. Weak men seek security. Strong men accept uncertainty." Frank lit a cigarette, watching Harlem wake up. Cars beginning to move, workers heading to legitimate jobs, children walking to school. Normal life unfolding over his invisible empire. "Anticipation," he murmured to himself, always 3 steps ahead. He knew Richie Roberts was closing in. He knew that sooner or later someone would talk. He knew that empires, especially criminal empires, do not last forever. Rome fell. Chinese dynasties collapsed. Al Capone was imprisoned. Luciano was deported.
Why would Frank Lucas be the exception? But in that moment, on that terrace, watching the empire he had built from nothing, Frank Lucas did not feel fear. He felt what Bumpy used to call strategic acceptance, the acceptance that power is temporary, that fortune can evaporate, that freedom is an illusion, but also the acceptance that for 7 years he had played the game perfectly. He had turned 20 kilos of heroin into a $300 million empire. He had fed families while destroying others, protected territory while corrupting the system, become a legend without seeking fame. Bumpy would be proud, Frank thought, flicking the cigarette butt over the parapet. At 7:05 a.m., he went back inside the mansion. Eva was preparing breakfast. The children were coming downstairs for school. Domestic life went on, normal, mundane, almost legitimate. But Frank Lucas knew the truth. Kings never rest. Empires never sleep.
And men who build fortunes on the ruins of other wives never know true peace. They only know the game. And Frank Lucas was the best player Harlem had seen since Bumpy Johnson. For now, that was enough.